He died, broke, with only 11 people at his funeral, yet his ideas would go on to control nations and shape the lives of billions. How did one of history's biggest failures become one of its most powerful figures? Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss this unbelievable story and discover how his ideas are still shaping your world today. Today, we are going to dive into the life of a man who is one of the most influential and also one of the most controversial figures in all of history. His name is Karl Marx. To millions of people, he was a hero. He was a revolutionary thinker who fought for the rights of workers and people who were oppressed. But to millions of others, he was a villain. They saw him as the father of dangerous ideas that led to revolutions, terrible conflicts, and political pain. But there is one thing that everyone can agree on. Karl Marx changed the world forever. He is considered one of the most influential philosophers in history, perhaps even more than Albert Einstein or Isaac Newton. When we think about how human society is shaped, why is that? Because his ideas did not just stay in books. They jumped out of the pages and into the real world. They led to political revolutions, huge economic changes, and powerful movements that still exist today. To truly understand his story, we have to understand his personal struggles, his deep thoughts, and his vision for a different kind of society. And please believe me, this is not just a history lesson. His ideas affect your life right now, probably more than you realize. This is why it is so important to hear the full story. By the end, you will not only understand the man Karl Marx, but you might also see the world around you in a way you never have before. So get ready to learn something that might just change the way you think about your own life. This story will not only teach you about Karl Marx, but it will also help you improve your spoken English. As you listen, you will learn new words, new sentence structures, and new ways to express complex ideas in a simple, clear way. Our story begins on May 5, 1818. Karl Marx was born in a town called Trier in Germany. At that time, Germany was not one single united country like it is today. It was a collection of different small kingdoms and states, all under the control of the powerful Prussian Empire. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a very successful lawyer, and his mother, Henriette Pressburg, came from a wealthy Dutch family. Karl's family was originally Jewish, but his father made the difficult decision to convert to Christianity. He did this to avoid discrimination because in Prussia at that time, Jewish people faced many restrictions and could not have certain jobs like being a lawyer. From a very young age, it was clear that Karl was special. He showed a great intelligence and a powerful curiosity about everything. He was a brilliant student, and he especially loved literature and philosophy. His father Heinrich looked at his bright son and hoped that Karl would follow in his footsteps. He dreamed that Karl would also become a lawyer and lead a successful, stable, and comfortable life. But young Karl had very different dreams. He was not interested in a quiet life. He was fascinated by history, by politics, and by the incredible power of ideas. When he was just 17 years old, Karl Marx went to the University of Bonn to study law just as his father wanted. But instead of spending his time focused on his books and his studies, he spent most of his time drinking with friends, going to parties, and even getting into duels. Yes, real sword fights. This wild behavior worried his father very much. So his father decided to send him to a much more serious university, the University of Berlin. It was here in the busy city of Berlin that Karl Marx's life changed forever. He became deeply, passionately interested in philosophy and politics. He was influenced by a famous philosopher named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's ideas completely shaped the way Marx started to think about the world. Hegel believed that history was always moving and always changing through a process of conflict. One idea, he said, fights against an opposite idea, and from this struggle, a new, better idea is born. This powerful concept inspired Marx to think deeply about society, about the struggles between different classes of people, and about power. During this time, Marx joined a group called the Young Hegelians. They were a radical group of students and thinkers who questioned everything. They questioned religion, they questioned the government, and they questioned the entire way society was structured. He began to write essays that criticized the government and the church. His words were sharp and fearless, and he quickly became known as a troublemaker in the eyes of the authorities. While he was studying in Berlin, something else wonderful happened in his life. Karl Marx fell deeply in love with a woman named Jenny von Westphalen. She came from a rich aristocratic family. In fact, her father was a baron. Jenny was 4 years older than Karl, and she belonged to a completely different social class. It was a love that was not supposed to happen. But despite all these differences, they loved each other deeply. Jenny was not just beautiful, she was intelligent and believed in Karl's ideas completely. She supported him with all her heart, even when it meant going against the wishes of her own family. They became engaged in 1836, but their love story was not going to be an easy one. Marx's radical political beliefs and his constant financial struggles would make their life together extremely difficult. After he finished his studies, Marx hoped to become a professor at a university. But because of his radical ideas, the government blacklisted him. This meant he was officially not allowed to teach at any university in Prussia. With no chance of a stable job, he turned to journalism. In 1842, Marx became the editor of a newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung. In its pages, he wrote powerful articles criticizing the government, the economic system, and the terrible struggles of poor workers. His writing was fearless, direct, and powerful. It didn't take long for the government to notice. Soon they shut down the newspaper completely. With no job and no future in Germany, Marx made a big decision. He decided to move to Paris, which was at that time the center of revolutionary ideas in Europe. In 1843, he and his beloved Jenny finally got married and moved to France together. It was there in Paris that Marx met another person who would change his life forever. Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels was a very unusual man. He was the son of a wealthy factory owner, but unlike most rich men of his time, he was deeply concerned about the poor and the terrible working conditions of factory workers. He had spent time in England and had seen with his own eyes how industrial workers, including children, suffered in the dark and dangerous factories. When Engels met Marx in a cafe in Paris in 1844, the two men started talking. They quickly realized they had the exact same vision for the world. They both wanted to fight for the working class and to challenge the capitalist system that they believed was the cause of so much suffering. Engels, who had a steady income from his family's business, began to support Marx financially because Karl was always struggling with money. This meeting was the beginning of a partnership that became one of the most famous and important intellectual collaborations in all of history. In Paris, Marx spent his days reading everything he could about economics and history. He read about past revolutions, about different economic systems, and about the long history of struggles between the rich and the poor. It was during this intense period of study that he started to develop the core ideas that would later be known as Marxism. He came to believe that all of human history was shaped by a simple, powerful conflict, the conflict between two main classes: the rich who owned the land and the factories, and the poor who owned nothing but their ability to work. He argued that capitalism, the system where businesses are privately owned, was designed to exploit workers and would one day collapse under its own problems. These ideas were, of course, radical and very dangerous at the time. The French government started to see Marx as a threat, a man who was encouraging revolution. In 1845, they expelled him from the country. So, Marx, along with Jenny and their first child, had to move again. They went to Brussels in Belgium. This move was important because Belgium at that time allowed much greater freedom of speech and political activity compared to other European countries. Marx took full advantage of this new freedom. He started writing, constantly expanding on his political and economic theories. One of the most defining moments of Karl Marx's life happened in Brussels. It was the deepening of his friendship with Friedrich Engels. As I mentioned, the two had met before in Paris, but it was here in Brussels that their amazing intellectual bond grew truly strong. Engels had seen the reality of the Industrial Revolution up close. He had written a powerful book about it called The Condition of the Working Class in England. His detailed observations about factory workers' child labor and economic exploitation gave Marx real-world evidence for his own theories. Together in Brussels, Marx and Engels decided to collaborate on a series of important political writings. They saw capitalism as a system that only benefited a small, wealthy group of elites while oppressing the great majority of people who did the actual work. They wanted to develop a complete theory that would help workers understand why they were oppressed, and more importantly, how they could fight against it. Marx and Engels spent many long hours working on a manuscript they called The German Ideology. This work laid the foundation for one of Marx's most important ideas: historical materialism. This is the idea that human history is not shaped by abstract ideas or by religion, but by material conditions, by the way we produce the things we need to live. They argued that a society's structure is built on its economic forces, and that history is just a long series of struggles between different economic classes. This book was truly groundbreaking. It rejected the dominant philosophical ideas of the time, which always focused on abstract thoughts and beliefs rather than the real material lives of people. Unfortunately, the German ideology was never published while Marx was alive. No publisher was willing to take the risk of printing such a radical and controversial work. However, the ideas written in that book would later go on to influence countless socialist movements all around the world. Here, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. Marx and Jenny made a very difficult choice. They chose to follow their beliefs, even though it meant leaving their home facing poverty and going against their families. What do you think about a decision like that? Is it more important to follow your passion and your principles, even if it leads to a very difficult life? Or is it wiser to choose a path that is more stable and secure? I would be so interested to read your thoughts about this in the comments below. Now back to our story. In Brussels, Marx also worked hard to unite socialist thinkers from all across Europe. He helped to establish something called the Communist Correspondence Committee. Its goal was to connect different socialist groups and revolutionaries from different countries. He dreamed of creating a truly international movement that could fight against capitalism on a global scale. During this time, Marx was not just a writer. He became deeply involved in practical, real-world political work. He gave speeches, he wrote articles for small newspapers, and he participated in meetings with workers and other intellectuals. He wanted his ideas to spread beyond books and into the streets, into the minds of ordinary people. But all of this activity started attracting the attention of governments across Europe. They were beginning to see him as a very dangerous revolutionary. In 1847, this work led to a very important moment. Marx and Engels joined a small secret group of radical thinkers called the Communist League. The League asked them to do something very special to write a manifesto, a document that would explain their ideas in a clear, simple, and powerful way for everyone to understand. The result was the Communist Manifesto, which was published in February of 1848. This short book would become one of the most influential and widely read political texts in all of human history. It begins with a famous haunting line, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." In the manifesto, Marx and Engels argued that throughout all of history, societies have always been divided into two groups, the oppressors and the oppressed. Under modern capitalism, they said the oppressors were the bourgeoisie, the rich business owners who owned the factories and the land. The oppressed were the proletariat, the massive class of industrial workers who had nothing to sell but their own labor. The manifesto was a powerful call to action. It called for workers of the world to unite and to overthrow the capitalist system. It proposed radical ideas like the abolition of private property, a progressive income tax-free education for all children, and the centralization of banking and credit in the hands of the state. These ideas were shocking and terrifying to the powerful people of the time, but they resonated deeply with many workers who felt exploited and forgotten by their employers. The year 1848, when the manifesto was published, was a turning point in European history. It was a year of fire. Revolutions broke out in several countries, including France, Germany, and Italy. People rose up demanding more rights and more freedom. Inspired by this growing unrest, Marx actively participated in these revolutionary activities. However, the Belgian government, fearing that he would inspire a rebellion in their own country, arrested him and quickly expelled him. Marx moved back to Paris, but after only a few months he was forced to leave again because of his political work. He then moved to Cologne in Germany, where he started a new radical newspaper called the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. In his articles, he encouraged workers to demand better wages, shorter working hours, and more political rights. He fearlessly criticized the German government and the monarchy, which of course made him a target of state repression once again. By 1849, the hope of the revolutions had faded. The revolutionary movements had failed and conservative governments regained control all across Europe. Marx was arrested and put on trial for his writings, and although he was acquitted, the government banned his newspaper and forced him to leave Germany one last time. At this point, Karl Marx and his family were essentially homeless. They had very little money and almost nowhere to go. He was a man without a country. In the summer of 1849, Marx moved to London, the city where he would spend the rest of his life. London at that time was a city of incredible contrasts. It was the powerful center of global capitalism, the richest city in the world. But it also had areas of deep, shocking poverty and terrible inequality. Here, Marx found himself in the perfect place to study the very system he had been critiquing his whole life. But at the same time, he and his family began to suffer from the most severe financial hardship they had ever known. Marx had hit rock bottom. He was an exile in a foreign city with a growing family and no money. The most difficult, but also the most important period of his life was about to begin. It was in London that he would suffer unimaginable personal tragedy, but also write the book that would define his legacy. To see how he survived and continued his work against all odds, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next part of this incredible story. Despite his growing reputation as a revolutionary thinker, Karl Marx had no financial security at all. He struggled just to provide for his wife Jenny and their children. They lived in a tiny, cramped apartment in Soho, an area of London that was known for its poor, dirty, and unhealthy living conditions. There were times when Marx couldn't even afford to buy bread or medicine. Jenny, who came from a wealthy, aristocratic family, had to take her small possessions one by one to the pawn shop just so they could eat. Tragically, the poverty they lived in had devastating consequences. 3 of their young children died due to malnutrition and diseases caused by their poor living conditions. This was a terrible, painful reality that deeply wounded both Marx and Jenny for the rest of their lives. To survive, Marx relied almost completely on his dear friend Friedrich Engels. Engels, who was working in his family's textile business in Manchester, sent money to Marx regularly whenever he could. Without this constant support from his friend, Marx might never have been able to continue his life-changing work. But even with this financial aid, Marx's life in London was marked by constant, exhausting struggle. Yet despite all these hardships, Marx never stopped his intellectual work. He spent countless hours, day after day, at the reading room of the British Museum. There, surrounded by books, he continued his research into capitalism, economics, and history. His main goal was to develop a complete and comprehensive critique of the capitalist system. This massive project led to his most significant and famous work, Das Kapital, which in English means capital. Das Kapital was not just a book, it was a deep, detailed analysis of how capitalism functioned, why it naturally led to inequality, and why Marx believed it would eventually collapse. In its pages, he examined how workers were exploited under capitalism. He argued that workers produced much more value than they were paid for in wages. This extra value, which he called surplus value, was kept by the capitalists, the owners of the businesses, as profit. To explain this in a simple way, imagine a worker in a factory who makes shoes. The worker's labor helps to produce shoes that are worth, let's say, $100. But the worker is only paid a wage of $30 for their day's work. The remaining $70 is taken by the factory owner as profit. Marx argued that this was a form of exploitation because the worker was not receiving the full value of their own labor. Marx believed that capitalism created a system where the rich, the bourgeoisie, would always grow wealthier and wealthier, while the workers, the proletariat, would continue to suffer. He predicted that eventually workers would understand this system, unite together, and overthrow capitalism, creating a new classless society. Even though he was living in poverty, Marx was still a very active political figure. He became deeply involved with the International Working Men's Association, which is also known as the First International. This organization aimed to unite workers from many different countries. Through speeches, articles, and discussions in the First International, Marx spread his ideas and influenced a new generation of socialist movements across Europe. However, Marx also faced a lot of opposition. Governments, of course, saw him as a dangerous revolutionary. And even some other socialist groups disagreed with his approach. Many people found his writings, especially Das Kapital, to be too complex and difficult to understand. His theories were often misunderstood or misrepresented by his enemies. Marx's personal life remained filled with tragedy. His wife Jenny, who had always supported him so bravely despite all their struggles, suffered from constant illness. The death of their children had caused both of them an immense and lasting grief. Marx himself developed serious health problems because of the poor living conditions, the constant stress, and the long hours of work. He suffered from liver disease, painful skin boils, and insomnia. Despite all these terrible difficulties, Marx never stopped writing. He continued working on Das Kapital, but only the first volume was published while he was alive. The later volumes were carefully completed and published by his loyal friend Engels after Marx's death. By the 1860s, Karl Marx's influence had started to grow far beyond the small revolutionary circles he was a part of. His ideas were beginning to spread across Europe, and he became more and more involved in international socialist movements. He used the First International as a platform to promote his ideas. He wrote speeches, he attended meetings, and he debated with other political thinkers. One of his biggest challenges was dealing with the anarchists, particularly a man named Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin believed that workers should immediately abolish the government, and replace it with small local cooperatives. Marx, however, argued that the state first had to be taken over and controlled by the workers before it could eventually be abolished. These deep ideological differences led to a major split within the First International, which seriously weakened the movement. Despite these conflicts, the First International did help to spread Marx's ideas to workers in France, Germany, Italy, and even Russia. His theory of class struggle resonated deeply with industrial workers who faced terrible exploitation and poverty every day. Many future socialist leaders, including Vladimir Lenin, were greatly inspired by Marx's work during this time. One of the most significant events influenced by Marx's ideas was the Paris Commune of 1871. After France was defeated in a war with Prussia, the workers of Paris rebelled. They took control of the city and tried to establish a new government based on socialist principles. Marx watched from London with great excitement. He saw the Paris Commune as proof that it was possible for workers to govern themselves. However, the Commune was brutally crushed by the French army. Thousands of workers were killed in the streets. Marx analyzed the Commune's failure and concluded that future revolutions would need much better planning and organization to succeed. It's a reminder of how powerful the human desire for a better world can be, but also how tragic the struggle for it can become. And if this part of our story has touched you, perhaps you could share it with someone who you think would appreciate this message of hope and struggle. By the early 1870s, the First International began to collapse, partly because of the internal conflicts between Marx and the anarchists. Also, many European governments were cracking down on socialist organizations, making it very difficult for them to operate. In 1876, the First International was officially disbanded. However, Marx's influence did not fade away. In fact, new socialist parties began forming across Europe, and Marxist ideas continued to spread and inspire people. In the last years of his life, Marx's health became much worse. He suffered from lung disease and was frequently ill. His dear wife Jenny passed away in 1881, and her death completely devastated him. He felt lost without her. On March 14, 1883, Karl Marx passed away in his armchair in London. He was 64 years old. His funeral, held at Highgate Cemetery, was a very modest and quiet affair. It was attended by only a small group of about 11 friends and comrades. His loyal friend, Friedrich Engels, delivered a powerful eulogy, declaring that Marx had revolutionized the way we understand history and society. He said, "Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history." Although Marx's death marked the end of his personal struggles, his ideas were just beginning their long journey. His works were translated into many languages, and socialist movements across Europe and beyond began to adopt Marxism as their guiding ideology. The legacy of Karl Marx is immense and complicated. His theories laid the foundation for modern socialism and communism. In the 20th century, leaders like Vladimir Lenin in Russia, Mao Zedong in China, and Fidel Castro in Cuba used Marxist ideas to shape the revolutionary movements in their countries. However, Marx's legacy is not without great controversy. Some critics argue that when Marxism was put into practice, it often led to authoritarian regimes and dictatorships that betrayed his original vision of liberation for the workers. Others believe that his critique of capitalism is still incredibly relevant today, especially when we analyze modern issues like income inequality, labor exploitation, and economic crises. Today, Marx's ideas continue to inspire debates in economics, politics, and philosophy. His concept of class struggle remains a central theme in discussions about social justice. All around the world, universities, scholars, and activists still study his works to understand the complexities of capitalism and to imagine the possibilities for a more fair and equitable society. Karl Marx's life was filled with incredible hardships, fierce intellectual battles, and an unwavering commitment to changing the world. He lived most of his life in poverty. He faced constant political persecution, and he lost many of the people he loved. And yet his ideas survived and went on to shape the course of history in ways he could never have imagined. Whether one sees him as a hero or as a villain, there is no denying that Karl Marx was one of the most influential thinkers in all of history. His work continues to challenge, to inspire, and to provoke discussions about the future of our society. On the day of his death, his close friend and comrade Friedrich Engels sat beside him. Engels later wrote, "On the 14th of March at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to think." As we heard, only 11 people attended his funeral at Highgate Cemetery in London. There was no grand ceremony, no large gathering, just a small handful of loyal friends. However, Engels gave a powerful speech saying, "His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work." And at that time, very few people could have imagined just how true those words would become. Marx died without ever seeing his ideas lead to a successful revolution. But within just a few decades, his writings began to shape history. In the 20th century, revolutions inspired by his ideas occurred in Russia, China, Cuba, and many other countries. However, it is also true that his ideas were often misinterpreted and misused. Some governments that claimed to be following Marxism became brutal dictatorships, suppressing freedom instead of creating equality. Marx himself had never promoted violence or oppression, but his complex theories were sometimes used to justify actions he likely never would have intended. Despite all the controversies, there are powerful and simple lessons we can take from Karl Marx's life. First, never stop questioning the world around you. Marx was never satisfied with the world as it was. He asked deep, difficult questions about society, economy, and justice. We should also learn to question unfair systems and to think critically about the world we live in. Second, knowledge is power. Marx spent his entire life reading, writing, and learning. He truly believed that understanding history and economics could help ordinary people change their lives for the better. If you want to succeed in your own life, never stop learning. Third, even if you are struggling now, your ideas can still change the world. Marx spent most of his life in deep poverty, but his ideas went on to shape the history of the 20th century. Your current struggles do not define your future. If you have a powerful idea, keep working on it. It might just change the world one day. And fourth, money controls much of society, but it shouldn't control your mind. Marx saw how capitalism could make people obsessed with money and profit. He warned that this focus could lead to exploitation and inequality. It is important to work hard and build a good life, but we should not let money become the only purpose or meaning in our lives. Karl Marx was a truly revolutionary thinker. Whether you see him as a hero or a villain, you simply cannot ignore his incredible impact on history. His name is still debated fiercely today. Some call him a genius, others call him dangerous. But one thing is absolutely certain. He changed the way people think about society, class, and power forever. His words, his struggles, and his sacrifices prove that one person's ideas can indeed shape the future long after they are gone. And that is why Karl Marx remains one of the most important figures in human history. And that's where our story concludes. This one was a real journey, wasn't it? I am so curious to hear your take on it all. What were your final thoughts as we reached the end of his life? Do you have any lingering questions about why a character did what they did, or about the ideas we talked about? Please leave all your opinions, theories, and questions below. I truly love reading them and building this conversation with all of you. Thank you for joining me today.